Welcome to the Intentional Encourager podcast, where each episode brings you compelling conversations and stories designed to entertain, enlighten, and encourage. And now here's your host, Brian Sexton.
And welcome into the Intentional Encourager podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sexton. Thank you for joining us again today. And this is a real treat because I've had these guys on individually on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Now we're going to go three wide. And you know what that means. That's a sports term. We're going to go three wide. So there's going to be a lot of sports in this conversation, a heavy dose of faith, and a lot of just sharing with these two great men that I have had the pleasure of calling friends, Chris and Jason Romano. And I use Chris first because he is the eldest, Jason, of the three Romano brothers. But Jason Romano is the host of the Sports Spectrum podcast that you can find online. Chris is a pastor of a church in New York, getting ready to transition to Florida, also the president of Vision Bible College. And so, again, you can find both these men on social media. They'll tell you where you can connect with them. You're going to want to do that after you hear this conversation with Chris and Jason Romano on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Guys, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Brian. I got to tell you, it makes me, it brings sweet music to my ears that you think Chris Romano is my older brother, because he's actually 2.5 years.
That's right. I forgot about that, man. I totally blew that intro, man. We had to start again. Yeah.
No, we don't have to start again. It's pretty clear who looks older and who looks younger.
Yeah. I appreciate. Yeah.
Well, you know, the thing about it is, Jay, you and I are pretty similar because we had one child and we said, okay, Lord, thank you for the one. Yeah. Chris has got a quiver. Chris has got his own, football. He's got half a football team and a starting five of a basketball team. So
yeah, that's right. That's right. 5.
Yeah, you took on the scripture, be fruitful and multiply. You took that on as a personal challenge, didn't you?
I did. Yes, I did.
He married a woman who comes from a family of like 100 people within like 2 generations. I mean, it's just all they do is have kids, apparently.
Yeah.
They populate our small town of Ravenna pretty much. So.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you I guess you decided, well, I've just got to, I've got to take this on myself. So yeah, I get it, man. I totally get it. You're just trying to be obedient to the word of God. That's exactly what you just tell people. I'm just trying to be obedient,
That's it, man. That's it. Yep.
Brian, I got to tell you, this is really awesome that we're doing this, because this is the first time that Chris and I have ever done an interview or on a podcast together like this.
Together.
So I'm really excited because, obviously I think I'm the person that, besides mom and that Chris and my dad, that Chris has known the longest, but we've done a lot of things together. We've never been asked to do an interview together on a show. So this is pretty cool. This is pretty neat for us.
Well, Jay, you've been on twice. Yeah. Jason's been on twice. Once, Jason so graciously was an endorser of my book, People Buy From People. And we did that podcast a few weeks back. And Jason was, Jason, you supported me from the get-go on this podcast. And I knew when you reached out and said, you've got to have Chris on, and Chris and I just had a tremendous conversation. When Chris and I wrapped that up, I said, we've got to do something, the three of us together.
I love it.
Yeah. And so, thank you for choosing this podcast to be the first time that you guys have done something together. So let's talk about, let's start here with sports and things like that. You guys have both shared on the Intentional Encourager podcast your love of sports, probably from the womb, a lot like me. I mean, my dad was very sports minded. I didn't hunt and fish because that's what a lot of people in my state do and in my region do. But man, anything with a ball, I was in on, and things like that. So take me through, Chris, I'll start with you. What's your earliest sports memory that you can really say, man, I remember this so clearly from my childhood?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe it's the memory I choose to remember, which would have been the 1981 NFC Championship game, where the Eagles defeated the Cowboys to get to the Super Bowl. We were living in Oak Brook Manor, Jay, I believe at that time, which is in Ravenna. Yeah. And
upstate New York.
We kind of flopped back and forth between my mother's house. My mom and dad divorced when I was 3, so 79. So we were back and forth from my mom's house to my dad, who lived in a duplex with my grandparents. And sports was always on the television at my grandparents' house or in my father's apartment. So to say what's the earliest memory, I think it'd probably be as a sporting event. It would be that. But we were always outside. We were always playing, long before we could sign up for Little League or Pop Warner or, youth basketball leagues and things like that. We were always playing. So, but I think it was that game that I can remember at least initially.
Jay, do you always, and Chris and I talked about this in the podcast where we were talking about being aligned, where my dad and I liked the same teams. We were Reds and Bengals fans. I've got my Reds mug this morning that I'm drinking out of.
Yeah.
I was kind of conditioned to okay, my dad liked it. My son's not like that. Like, we have a room in our house that we painted orange and black and put Bengals things around. And my son decided after the Green Bay Packers beat the Pittsburgh Steelers in the Super Bowl about 11 or 12 years ago, he was going to be a Green Bay Packers fan. Ooh. And this year they play in Cincinnati. So that's going to be a little bit of an angst-filled moment between father and son on my end. But Jason, I want to go here for just a second. What do you remember? What's your earliest sports memory around either being with your dad or being with Chris or what have you? What sports memory comes to mind for you?
Well, there's a few because I was a little older than Chris, and certainly I go back to probably there's a picture I have that I love to just post on social media every so often of me wearing a Roger Staubach jersey. And I got a little Roger Staubach figurine for my 6th birthday in September of 1979. So clearly I was a big sports fan at that point. If I'm wearing a jersey, I don't really remember a whole lot from that year. Like, I can't pick a game. I do remember that Super Bowl was the Steelers and the Rams, and Vince Ferragamo was a quarterback for the Rams. And I'm sure you remember this, Chris. Like, that name stood out. Like, I think because he was Italian and my grandfather and my dad, both Italian men, like, fell in love and wanted to see the steel curtain lose. So I remember Vince Ferragamo's name, weirdly enough, the Rams quarterback, as a little kid. But the game that I remember was the same game, ironically, that Chris is referring to, which is that 1981 NFC or 1980, I guess, NFC championship.
Yeah, 80.
Played in January of 81 when the Eagles beat the Cowboys 20-7. And I just remember crying, like being a little kid and crying that my team had lost. I am a Cowboys fan. Chris is an Eagles fan, which we can get into the dynamics of that if you want, and how that's been going on for the last 40 years.
Oh, sure. I'm down for a good sibling fight this morning on
I don't want to get into that. But I'll tell you, you asked about the following in your parents' footsteps or liking the team.
Yeah.
Our house is a complete mess of sports fandom, because we very early, my dad still makes fun of us that I chose the Cowboys because I saw them in 77 or 78. They were on all the time as a kid. The Giants are my dad's team. And yes, you're probably doing the math as you listen to this, people, that my dad's a Giants fan and Chris is an Eagles fan and I'm a Cowboys fan. So we're all fans of the rival teams.
Except for your younger brother, Damian, Jason, because we were talking about that. He, like me, is a long-suffering Detroit Lions fan, and we were talking about how my Bengals and his Detroit Lions still hold the longest active playoff drought. I mean, they've been to the playoffs, they just haven't won anything.
Yeah, he was probably, as a little kid, he was a Giants fan. I think he aligned with our dad for the most part, and then he discovered Barry Sanders, and he just defected, I guess. But we never, it wasn't like an intentional, I hate your team and I don't want to root for them type of thing. We just saw other teams and thought, that's a good team to root for. And literally every single team that my brothers and I root for are all different in every sport. None of us align. Now, Chris had, like you said, a population of kids in his house, and somehow he's gotten them all to align for the most part to root for the teams that he roots for. I failed at that with my daughter, at least in football. Baseball, we like the same team. We're both Mets fans, but I don't know. I wish, there's often times where I wish like our whole family, the whole pack of 10 or 12, 3 brothers and all of our kids all like the same teams and would all wear the same jerseys. There's kind of a unique unity in that, but we just all went our own ways. And I'm glad that we've never left that, though. When I think about like sports fans who in their 30s, like, I'm just going to root for a new team because I live in a different city. It's like, no, we're sticking with the teams that we like since we were 3 or 4 years old.
When you guys get together, and there's that, let's say it's Thanksgiving, and let's say that the particular year the Cowboys and the Eagles play each other. Yep. Things like that. That's always been a Thanksgiving wish of mine, that my Bengals would play on Thanksgiving. The NFL just never allows it for some reason.
Joe Burrow will get a Thanksgiving shot one year.
Fingers crossed. Yeah, Cowboys Bengals on Thanksgiving. That'd be pretty sweet. But no, do you guys? What's it like when you guys get together and watch a sporting event, especially when your teams are playing each other? Is it just like, hey, bro, I love you, but for the next 3 hours, man, it may get a little tense here at times. Are you guys, because you guys, growing up playing sports and things like that, obviously have competitiveness in your family. What's it like when you guys watch games together?
Chris, you go first there.
Yeah, so I'll take this one. We tend to try to avoid it, to be honest with you. If our teams are playing each other, because we love each other first and foremost, and at the same time, we are passionate fans that, you want to enjoy the game. So from our perspective, if the Eagles and Cowboys are playing against each other, particularly in a meaningful game, I mean, really in any game, but in a meaningful game, you want to try to enjoy that moment rooting for your team without like making the other one, feel like, like a loser. So, we tend to avoid it. There have been a few times when we have actually connected. There's a few highlights that I can recall. One was the Chris Boniel game at your apartment, Jay.
That would have been 97.
A Monday night game. Yep. That game. And then let's see, was it the 2014 or 15 Thanksgiving?
14. Yeah.
Thanksgiving. Where the Eagles just shellacked Dallas in Dallas.
Destroyed.
That was the end of, or near the end of the Chip Kelly run. And then we watched the 2019. No, actually, that was Eagles Giants. You were there though.
We watched a game at my house. Remember a Sunday night around Christmas when the Eagles and Cowboys were playing for the NFC Championship game, and Dallas lost Tony Romo. He hurt his back and he couldn't play, and it was Kyle Orton, I think, played.
That was 2013. Yeah,
13, the year
Kelly's
before.
First year. Yeah.
And so we watched. Surprisingly enough, we watched those games together. But I think it was because it was Christmas. It was because it was Thanksgiving. If it was a random, October game, I'm not intentionally taking the drive to Chris's house to watch the Cowboys and Eagles with him, because I want to enjoy the game if we win, and I want to want to just turn it off if we lose. And by the way, we're strictly talking about football here. I don't think you and I care if it's the Pirates and the Mets, and even if it was in a playoff game and we watched it together, I think we would, because our devotion for other sports is not as deep as it is for the game of football.
Well, and that goes to show you, Jason, where the NFL has gone. So let's go here for just a second. The NFL has dominated the sports landscape. It has really taken over America, because the three of us were talking before we started recording. As we record this, this week is the NFL draft. Everybody's talking about the NFL draft. If there would be a blockbuster trade that would go down today, then that would dominate ESPN.com. It would dominate the sports talk shows. That's how dominant the NFL is in the landscape of American sports. It trumps everything. And so, I can understand why, a Pirate Met game, even in the playoffs, would not be as impactful as a playoff game, an NFC championship game between the Cowboys and Eagles. And so, Jason, I want you to put on.
Goodness.
Yeah.
If that ever happens again, by the way, I might have to go watch it with him though. That's a different type of game.
Well, okay. So I want you to put on your sports hat for a minute. You spent a lot of years at ESPN. I want you to, and Chris, I want to get your perspective on this as well. What do you think the NFL has done to absolutely capture the hearts of America the way it has, to where the NFL is a 52-week a year league, 365 days? You could talk NFL and people are all in on that. What did you see in your time at ESPN, Jason, that caused that shift? Because you could say for years, and forgive me for being a little long-winded with the question, when we were growing up, it was baseball. Mm-hmm. Like it was Monday Night Baseball. I remember watching a ton of Monday Night Baseball games, watching, growing up being a Cincinnati Reds fan. That was my team, and then the other teams just were right behind it. But now I find myself today, I'm like, I'll talk Bengals all year long. We'll talk NFL all year long. What did you see in your time there? And Chris, I want your perspective as well, where that shift happened to where people are just football crazy now.
We were kind of more baseball than football crazy, I think, as kids too. I mean, as Chris got a little older and started playing football and was really good at it, I think football started to take a shift, especially as our teams got better and started to have rivalries and we were getting older into our 20s. But as little kids, I remember, especially because we played Little League, and our teams were pretty good and it started to get better and had some good players. Baseball was probably my number one sport from, I still love the Cowboys, but from like the mid 80s until probably when Dallas finally got better again in the early 90s. So baseball was still my love too, but I saw a shift. It's funny you say that, Brian, because when I got to ESPN 21 years ago, football was by far the biggest sport, even when I got there. And the NFL and ESPN was all invested into this sport of the NFL. And they also saw that and I saw this over a period of a decade, their ratings were always higher when it came to talking about football. So when we did a story on Outside the Lines or on another generic show or a Sports Center, and it was during the football season, the ratings were always higher. And it was, out of football season, quote unquote, not games being played, it was lower, but then the draft would come or free agency would come and they would go back up. And you saw, okay, this is because people are crazy about football. And then you had the internet era, you had fantasy football that really, fantasy baseball was the first ever kind of fantasy thing that Chris and I ever played when we were kids. We called it rotisserie baseball. And we used to make our own fantasy leagues up. That was before fantasy sports were popular. But then you get internet and fantasy sports and gambling, which they finally acknowledged as a thing because it's legalized. But back then, gambling was huge. I didn't ever partake in anything like that. But I just think, and the fact that every single game matters so much. Baseball, you get 162. If you get shut out 14-0, you turn around and you play the next day. Football, you are sulking for 6 days if you get shut out 45-0 and you are done. And it's like, it can affect your attitude. I don't know. I just think that there's a giant passion around football because of the fact that every game means so much and because it's so hard, as you can see and witness by the team that I root for. They haven't been in the Super Bowl in 25 years. It's so hard to get there that, I think it means more from that perspective. What do you think, Chris?
I think that I was going to actually say, or go in the direction that you mentioned at the end there. I think there's a dynamic of there's only one, your only team only plays one time a week. Mm-hmm. And you can be out of it so quickly. You know what I mean? If you go on a 3 or 4 game losing streak, your season's over. Whereas in the other sports, like I just saw with the Oakland Athletics, they lost their first 6 games. And then most recently until yesterday, they were on a 12-game winning streak. And so you could turn your season around just like that. Football, that's just, you're not permitted that. So I think that element is involved that certainly gets the attention of the world. But I got to be honest with you, as someone who's played and coached the game, there's something about the game itself that is unique. And I consider it to be, and I think many would agree with me, that it's the ultimate team sport. Like in baseball, what was it? Madison Baumgartner yesterday pitched a no-hitter, a 7-inning no-hitter. One guy can just completely dominate the game. Not that he doesn't need help, but he can literally take over the game by himself. Basketball, it's similar. A Kevin Durant, a LeBron James, a Steph Curry. In football, even the greatest quarterbacks, as we saw in the Super Bowl, a Pat Mahomes, if he doesn't have an offensive line that's going to protect him, he can't do what he can. He's been blessed to be able to do. So it really isn't. It's a team sport. It involves moving parts, various components. Guys need each other. There's a struggle. There's a toil. There's a preparation, and yes, there's features of that in every other sport. But there's something about football, and I think that people connect with that because life is like that. And so that's what I would say. I would say that's why it dominates the landscape.
Yeah, I love that take, Chris. And I want to build a little more on that when we come back. I'm going to step aside, take a quick break. We come back, we're going to build a little more conversation around that. I am so happy to have the Romano brothers with me this morning, Chris and Jason Romano. And again, you're going to love the rest of this conversation. Come on back here on the Intentional Encourager podcast.
Hey, everybody, Brian Sexton here. I want to tell you about our sponsor, SEO National. SEO stands for Search Engine Optimization. Now, what's that, you might say? Well, search engine optimization helps you show up higher on search engines in front of paying customers for words that you as a business owner can monetize. What a great concept. SEO National is owned by my good buddy Damon Burton, who's been a guest here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Not only has Damon and his team worked with businesses of all sizes, from e-commerce startups to NBA teams and Shark Tank featured businesses, but more importantly, Damon and his team are about transparency, trust, and providing lifetime value. So much so that he still has his first customers after opening SEO National 14 years ago. Let me give you some intentional encouragement and call Damon and his team today at 855-736-6285 or go to www.seonational.com and get a free quote.
Hey, Chris, I want to jump on what you just said there a couple minutes ago. And let's talk about the NFL this year is going to do for the first time a 17-game season. You were talking about playing and coaching the game and things like that. Put your coaching hat on for a minute. How do you motivate guys an extra regular season game? Because the way the model has been since the 1970s, since all of us have watched football, is that we're used to a 16-game season. We're used to 4 exhibition games. If you play in the Hall of Fame game in Canton, which is not about 4 hours from where I am, but if you play in the Hall of Fame game, you play that extra exhibition game. Now you've got a 17-game regular season. How do you think that is going to affect players and coaches with that extra regular season game?
Well, I'll just start with the fan perspective. We've been so conditioned to use certain euphemisms like a team. You can't use that anymore because outside of somebody who has a tie, you're not going to have a team, right?
Yeah.
We used to joke about the Cowboys during the Jason Garrett era. They were always 8-8, now a team's going to be 8-9, or 9-8. It just seems very strange to be able to say that.
Yeah.
But as far as motivating players, I think that it's going to be difficult because of the risk factor. With 16 games and 4 preseason games, you've already seen pushback in the last several years from players who don't want to play in the preseason, even older players who don't want to participate in OTAs or training camp and things of that nature. So that is going to be a definite challenge. I think there's going to be things that are built into the contracts, conditions, that kind of thing. Whether it's resting on certain peak or, only devoting X amount of hours into, whatever team team preparation, conditioning. But hey, NFL is a corporation, and money is what rules. And so you're either going to be a part of it or you're going to get driven right out of it. And so as a coach, I think you have to pace yourself just as you do in a 16-game season. I don't think one game is going to make that much of a difference in terms of how we approach the game, in terms of schematically or strategically. But at the end of the day, it's just like, I'm sure what took place, what was it, 1970 when they went from 12 to 16? It's going to be a little bit of a transition. It's just kind of our transition because we've had 16-game seasons, most of our lives. But they'll get used to it. They'll adjust, and NFL will be fine.
It's the almighty dollar, Brian. The almighty dollar. That's what it is, honestly, in my opinion, and the fan perspective. But the fan perspective, it still comes down to the almighty dollar. So the NFL adds another game, and they push everything out, and they go an extra week, and now you have the Super Bowl being played the second week of February, I think this year, like February 12th. It's later. Yeah, wow. So everything's pushed out, but that just adds another week of excitement that the NFL can make more money off of. And I'm not saying that in a bad way, because I'm a fan and I want that.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of the players, and they're not really excited. I mean, I don't think they get paid more money. It just spreads out longer. So if you have a $10 million contract, you still get 10 million. It just, you get it over 17 games versus.
I think that's the case right now, but certainly in the next collective bargaining agreement, I'm sure they'll negotiate that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, guys, here's the thing. Where do you stop? You go to 17 games, and Chris, I love where you took us to there when the NFL. And I was reminded when O.J. Simpson broke the rushing record, broke the 2,000 yards in 1973. There was a lot of angst about that because they said, well, the record was set in a 14-game season, and now OJ's got a 16-game season. Kind of like the Roger Maris argument back in 61 when Maris broke Babe Ruth's record, and they said, well, if he doesn't do it in 154 games, it's not going to count, and we're going to put an asterisk by it because it took him 8 more games. Look, it's not Roger Maris's fault that baseball expanded to 162 games. It's not. He was playing within the regular season that he was in. It's not OJ's fault that he played in a 16-game schedule, and Jim Brown's record was in a 14-game schedule. But here's where I want to, and Chris, I'm glad you took us there. So now, where do we go from here? Because to your point, the fans are going to drive this bus. And if you ask people, do you want more football? The three of us on this call are going to say, absolutely, we want more football. Do you go to an 18? I was just kind of curious why they stopped at 17 and not go to 18 and take the 2 exhibition games off. Just give us a nice, clean number, because you're right. The 8-8, you're like, oh yeah, 8-8. Well, now it's, now you're going to have teams that finish 8-9,
so
and it's going to be like, well, it's a losing record. You would almost be better off from a record perspective tying a game and go, yeah, we went 8-8-1. So you don't have a losing record. You don't have a winning record. It's just going to be strange. I'm just kind of curious why they went to 17 and not just go on to 18.
I don't know that there was a real method to that madness except just to add another game, because again, the revenue that they bring in is so astronomical. I got to make a point though, because as a fan, whether it's 16 or 17 really doesn't affect me as much. I mean, another week of watching regular season football is great, in one sense, but I enjoy the off season in some cases just as much as I enjoy the season. Now, there's nothing that replaces a Sunday afternoon 1:00 game, watching the Eagles play the Giants or the Cowboys. I mean, I love that. There's a euphoric high about it, the lead up to it in the morning, the aftermath discussing the game. But the off season has become just as enjoyable because especially for a team like where the Eagles sit right now, where they're not good, they're probably not going to be good, but it's the chess pieces that are moving in the offseason of cutting this guy, signing this guy in free agency, making a trade for this, drafting this prospect or firing this coach, hiring this coach, bringing this offensive coordinator, all these facets of the offseason game that are, again, keep my attention, whether it's on the Eagles app the official NFL app of the Eagles, or whether it's Bleacher Report or ESPN. So I don't know that they had to add a game to conjure up interest, except for the fact that they just bring in so much money for that one extra game.
Yeah, Jason. Go, Jason. Yeah,
I was going to say, I agree from a fan's perspective. I want to go back to what you just said for a second, Brian. The records. I wasn't old enough to remember. I think it was 77. The year the Cowboys won the Super Bowl, they were 12-2. The next year they were in the Super Bowl against the Steelers and lost. They were 12-4. So that was, I think 78 was the year. And they jumped from 14 to 16 games.
Yeah.
And so you saw all the records change, right? And so OJ's, rushing record stood until I think Eric Dickerson broke it in 84. 2158, I think was what he got, something like that. So, and people said, okay, well, he broke it by 145 yards, so it's legit. But he also did it in 16 games. Now you add 17, I think you're going to see a lot of records broke.
There's no question.
Be broken, and then we're going to say, oh, look, he broke this record. I'm like, well, he got an extra game. I mean, if you have Drew Brees could have thrown for 6,000 yards potentially with an extra game, or Peyton Manning, I think once threw for like 5,500 yards or whatever. You give him an extra game, of course, you're going to potentially see somebody throw for 6,000 yards in a season now. Somebody might rush for 2,200 yards in the NFL because there's an extra game. It may not happen, or 2,000 receiving yards. So how do you gauge those as records?
I agree with you, but I also think that you're going to see, maybe not immediately, but I think there's going to be a pacing where guys will sit games, whether it's earlier in the season or.
Yeah.
So, and I'm talking about like just to preserve their body, or let's say a team is, 14-2 or something like that, or 13-3, and they're not going to play that last game. So they're going to, which a lot of even happens now, where guys sit out the last game of the year and potentially could be a record breaker. So I think in the initial part of this transition, I think you're going to see record break, especially because the NFL is different now anyway. It's so offense driven.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, I love what you said there. And Jason, I want to come to you on this because you're talking about the impact of records. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me a lot of times, and again, I'll go back to your days at ESPN. When a guy is going after a record, a lot of times, and it used to be this way, that if there was programming going on, they would break into that programming to see the guy get the record. And I think fans love that. Fans love it. I love what you guys were talking about there about the impact of records, because let's say a guy is going for 6,000 yards passing. Let's say Tom Brady's regular season is either Brady or Manning. I think Manning holds that now. But let's say a guy is getting ready to throw touchdown pass number 60 in a season. And I don't think that's far-fetched. I mean, we've seen 50.
I don't either.
We've seen 6,000. We've seen 5,000 yards and 50 touchdowns. I think to your guys' point, 6,000 yards passing and 60 touchdowns is right there on the threshold. Is that going to affect how games are now flexed? So the NFL does a flexing, as you guys know, they flex games. So let's say, wishful thinking, let's say Joe Burrow has got 57 touchdown passes in the season. And let's say the Bengals' last regular season game is against the Browns, and Burrow is on the cusp of throwing for 60 touchdowns in the season. Does the NFL flex that game to a Sunday night game so that the fans can see a guy break a passing record? Or let's say, for instance, again, I don't know who Philadelphia's backs are or Dallas's back, but I'll use Joe Mixon. Let's say Joe Mixon is on the cusp of breaking the single season rushing record. Now does the NFL flip itself and say, okay, we need to put the Bengals on Monday night to accommodate this record? You guys have brought us to a fascinating place, and I appreciate that, because now the possibilities are infinite, what you can do. And I think you saw this year, the NFL is the ultimate made-for-TV sport. They were playing in front of empty stadiums, and nobody knew it because the game on the field was just there.
Yeah.
And it was so good. Where do you think – both of you guys jump in on this. Where do we go from here with the NFL experience? Do we go to 18 games? Do we go to 20 games? Where do you think the NFL goes with their schedule?
Chris, go ahead.
I think it's just going to go international. I think they've been moving in the direction of playing in Europe, playing in London, playing in Mexico. I think where the game is going to go is international. And I think that's where Goodell and I think that's where the powers that be want it to go. It already is an international sport. I've actually traveled overseas wearing some Eagle gear, and you can see people respond to it like they know. And I'm talking like even third world places. So it's a global reality that I think that if anything, as much as being made about going to 17 games, I personally don't think it's that big a deal. But where it's going is going to be that, and how they merge the international, whether it's just playing in stadiums internationally or eventually getting international team. I don't know about that, but I think that's definitely where it's going.
I think, yeah, I agree. And I think there's no way they'll ever go to 20 games. Like to me, I shouldn't say no way because you never say never, but it just feels 20 games feels way too much, and these guys are really hurting after 16 games. I think the most you could see going is 18 with 2 bye weeks and 2 exhibition games. I think that's probably the most. If you go anywhere further, that's where you would go. And I think that would, if you get there, that's going to be what it's going to be like for the next 40 years or whatever.
Jay, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
I got a question for you. Do you think that they'll ever merge the conferences, or like whether it's like, say, a tournament type deal at the end, or do you think they'll maintain the fidelity of the conferences?
Wow. I haven't thought about that. I mean,
that's a great question, Chris.
I mean, the conferences have been around for 50 years. 1970, I think, was the first year of the merger, and they've done it for 50 years. So I have a hard time believing. Plus, if you do that, Chris, it takes away from you and I, going at it every year with our 2 teams. It takes away rivalries. It takes away divisions. If you're going to merge it as a tournament, they're going to have to do a better job on keeping those rivalries as rivalries. Keeping the divisions aligned, I think. I don't think they'd ever do that. But that's, again, thinking outside the box. I'm sure somebody's in a room.
Well, Chris, you bring up a great point, because the 17th game of the schedule this year is a game outside of your conference. So the Bengals will play the 49ers in Cincinnati for the 17th game.
Yeah, Dallas plays New England, I think. And who's the Eagles play?
Yeah. They probably play the Jets.
So what they've done is they've said, okay, your division is not scheduled to play this division as a whole, but we're going to sprinkle this one in for the 17th game and making it because the Bengals are supposed to play the NFC Central this year. So they've got the Packers, the Bears, the Vikings, and the Lions this year. And then you get the 49ers sprinkled in there as an extra game. But here's something interesting. I want to pivot here for just a second before we take a break. Mm-hmm. I want to pivot here for just a second. Jason, you were talking about the almighty dollar, and I love what you said there because it's absolutely correct. Why do you think there's been such reticence in the college game, as big as college football is, to follow the NFL model? Because, there was angst about putting a playoff system in. And we've seen that the playoff system works beautifully. Now, and there was angst to go to 4 teams. Now there's talk about going to 8 teams. And I grew up, Marshall, the school that I went to, before they went Division I, they were a 1AA program. And 1AA beautifully has a playoff system. I mean, they have a 1 through 16 playoff system that's beautiful. And it works out so well. Why do you think college football has been so reticent to go to a playoff system like that, when there's so much money available for content there in the college game?
I think the NFL was always afraid of bucking the system, of messing with what they perceived was working, and the sort of quote unquote purity of the game, the amateur sports that is. But I think we've known now over the last few years, it's been this way forever. We just maybe weren't paying close enough attention, that it's a big business, a gigantic business, especially when you saw what happened with the Final Four in 2020 and how much money they lost losing that NCAA tournament. And it was like almost in the billion number, but it was in the largely high millions of numbers that they lost. And you saw, oh my gosh, it is about the almighty dollar in college too. Let's not kid ourselves here. I think it's a purity of the game type of thing. It's amateur keeping the amateurs, but I think they've realized where they're going now. And they're still reluctant on a lot of different things. I mean, just follow Jay Billis on Twitter and you'll see what he's talking about as far as the NCAA just not fully grasping.
I love Jay Billis on Twitter. I love Jay Billis because he brings up such incredibly good points, Jason, because let's not kid ourselves. College athletics, you talk about a big business. I mean, the NCAA tournament itself, you could put that against it. And I don't know what the NFL revenue numbers are, and it probably still dwarfs it. But I would argue that their revenues just for the NCAA tournament would almost rival what baseball takes in.
Brian, just take a trip to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which I just happened to do a couple of months ago. I was down in Tuscaloosa speaking to a group of young people, and I got to tour Tuscaloosa a little bit. The guys that were with me were Alabama grads who had either played at Alabama or had been there for 30, 40 years. One guy was a historian who I was friends with, and he took me around. And if you don't see when you take a trip around Alabama's campus that there's a very large amount of money that's been handed to them because of their success, obviously. And I'm sure because of boosters and people who are, it's a business. Let's just be honest. I mean, it's a college atmosphere too, and kids are learning and they're going to college. But
yeah,
it's also, say, Chris.
Sure.
You broke up there. Say it again.
Well, Jason, to your point, and we'll get Chris back in. Yeah.
In part, I said that it's as much as it is.
Well, and money. Yeah,
you were breaking up, Chris. I'm sorry.
And Chris, we'll jump back to you in just a second. Jason, your point is so well made because, again, for years, and again, I went to Marshall, a mid-major program, but 4 years ago or 5 years ago now, they built a practice facility next to the stadium because that's what you have to do now, even as a mid-major, to compete with the Alabamas and the West.
Brian, listen to this. When I was in Tuscaloosa, he was taking me around, giving me the tour. And I said, what's that? It was a football field that we drove by, Bryant-Denny Stadium, I think is what it's called, the big stadium where Alabama plays, and saw that. And then we're just driving around campus and I saw another kind of what looked like a practice field. And I said, is that where the team practices? He just laughed at me. He goes, no, that's for the band. And I said, what do you mean for the band? He's like, they built probably $200,000 worth of a full football field with goalposts and lines drawn on it and everything for the band to practice on, because the band needs to be good and the band needs to be top notch. So they invested hundreds of thousands of dollars to build a football field that isn't even being used to play football on. That's how much money Alabama has. And yes, they do that because they have to compete. You're right. You have to have the facilities to be able to compete, but it's a religion. It's huge from the money perspective. And listen, there's something about, that's why kids are, we're going through this right now with my daughter. Chris is going through it with his son, Caleb. College is expensive. And why is it expensive? Well, it's expensive not just because you're getting the education and that's what you're paying for. You're paying for, in many cases for these colleges, the experience to say that you go to X, Y, or Z school. And and they have the ability to put in Chick-fil-A's and put in these unbelievable dining halls and to put in all these resources, and the dorm rooms are better than the house I live in. Like they're able to put all that in because they charge the money, because the kids pay for the experience. So I hate to say this, it comes back to the money though. It's a money situation. It's a business, and they're also nonprofit, by the way. So they get a lot of tax exemptions in college. They have a lot of extra money lying around to put into these areas to build around, like Alabama has done.
Well, you boys both have my cell phone numbers. Having a son already in college, you boys both have my cell number, so you can call me when you start getting a little weepy when your kids go to college.
Brian, unless you can pay for my kids' college, that's the only thing I'm looking at.
Can't even pay for my own kids' college, let alone yours.
Chris has got a little ace in the hole because his son's a pretty good football player, and we're hoping he can get a scholarship.
Well, I told Chris, I said, listen, send his tape to Coach Charles Huff at Marshall. Let's get him. He'll compete with a kid named Cole Pennington. I don't know if that last name rings a bell to you. Of course.
Yeah, I heard that.
He probably will compete there. But Jay, listen, I want to park there for just a minute. We'll step aside and take our last break. But you're exactly right. Money drives everything in college athletics. By the way, Alabama coached by West Virginia native Nick Saban from about 3 hours from here, a little bit north of here. But you see, and again, I've seen that when I was a student at Marshall back in the early 90s is when they built the football stadium. They built a 36,000 seat stadium. Everybody was just kind of losing their minds like, oh my gosh, how are we going to fill this thing? And now it's the luxury boxes. And now it's the practice facility. I mean, for years, people were like, well, we can't compete unless we have a practice facility, an indoor practice facility. That's what everybody wants now is an indoor. And then we talk about Clemson, the facility that Clemson has got, what, a $60 or $70 million football only facility.
Well, let's be clear, Brian, too. I mean, you still have to win. And Chris, I know you'll say this too. You have to have a team.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
Yeah. You have to have good coaches and good recruiters and good players. Marshall gets put on the map because they get Chad Pennington and Randy Moss, right? And so they're put on the map and suddenly they can go
Vinny
down.
Curry.
And who else, Chris?
Vinny Curry.
Vinny Curry, right?
Absolutely. There you go. And Byron Leftwich, the offensive coordinator of the Super Bowl champion Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So
you see where I'm going here. Yeah. So you also need like personnel, but you got to win. And in order, Clemson doesn't build that facility if they don't have the success that they have with Dabo and with those teams being in college football playoffs every year and winning championships. You need to have success because some of these other schools that haven't been good for many years, you're not getting the right recruits. You're making poor decisions with coaching or whatever, and then you don't have the money to build into this or that. And so, it comes down to the money, but you also have to be pretty successful too, right, Chris?
Well, everything in economics is what kind of return am I going to get on my investment? So the investments made with the thought of the dividend is going to be worth my while. You don't invest in something that you don't believe is valuable. So that's really the name of the game. And no matter if it's college sports or professional sports or even high school sports, I could tell you stories about high schools that have booster clubs as well.
Yeah.
Is the investment is dependent upon what someone or some entity believes the dividend is going to be worth it. Like you guys were talking about Alabama there for a while. The dividend has been astronomical. And of course, it's not just the product on the field. They give back. When they become professional athletes or they become successful businessmen or they become, whatever they become, they pour back into what the original investment. And Absolutely. So that's really how it's played.
Well, you mentioned Vinny Curry. The weight room at Marshall University is the Vinny Curry weight room. He donated the money for the weight room at Marshall. And so it bears his name now. And Vinny Curry was a guy. Yeah. Vinny Curry was a guy, Chris, that wasn't highly recruited. Marshall went to New Jersey and found him. He came to Marshall and became a second round draft pick of the Philadelphia Eagles and has done incredibly well. Let's step aside, take a quick break. I want to pivot. And I want to talk about something that is vitally important to all three of us, and that's faith. And I want to go here. Chris and Jason are both in ministry roles. And so let's talk. I want to pivot here and talk about the importance of faith. We talked a bunch about sports, but you're really going to miss it if you don't understand who the three of us are and who's really at the core of what we are and who we are. I'm talking the incredible privilege of having Chris and Jason Romano join me this morning here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Back in just a moment.
Dividend has been astronomical. And of course, it's not just the product on the field. They give back. When they become professional athletes, or they become successful businessmen, or they become, whatever they become, they pour back into what the original investment. And so that's really how it's played.
Well, you mentioned Vinnie Curry. The weight room at Marshall University is the Vinnie Curry weight room. He donated the money for the weight room at Marshall, and so it bears his name now. And Vinnie Curry was a guy. Yeah, Vinnie Curry was a guy, Chris, that wasn't highly recruited. Marshall went to New Jersey and found him. He came to Marshall and became a second-round draft pick of the Philadelphia Eagles and has done incredibly well. Let's step aside, take a quick break. I want to pivot, and I want to talk about something that is vitally important to all three of us, and that's faith. And I want to go here. Chris and Jason are both in ministry roles. And so let's talk. I want to pivot here and talk about the importance of faith. We talked a bunch about sports, but you're really going to miss it if you don't understand who the three of us are and who's really at the core of what we are and who we are. I'm talking the incredible privilege of having Chris and Jason Romano join me this morning here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Back in just a moment. Hey, everybody, Brian Sexton. Want to tell you about my new book, People Buy From People, 10 Powerful People Lessons from the Ultimate People Person, my dad. My dad was one of the greatest connectors that I ever knew, and he shared with me 10 connecting principles that I have used throughout my 25-year sales and sales management, customer engagement, and leadership career that I'm passing along to you. If you want to be a stronger, deeper, and more powerful connector, you've got to pick up a copy of People Buy From People. There are concepts in there that you may not realize help make you a power connector. You can go to Amazon and pick it up, Kindle if you're an e-reader and you like to do it that way, or now available on Audible. And there's one other way you can get a copy of People Buy From People. You can get one from me, and I'll sign it for you. You go to intentionalmediaandpublishing@gmail.com and send me an email, and I'll share with you the link on how you can get a signed copy. You can buy a signed copy directly from me. Again, People Buy From People. If you want to connect like never before, pick up your copy today of People Buy From People. And now let's get back to more great conversation here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Back here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. And I want to pivot now to faith and the importance of faith. Chris, I want to start with you. We talked about it when you were on the Intentional Encourager podcast about the impact. You said something about the consecration that happened in your home around the pandemic and things like that. Mm-hmm. Let's fast forward now. We're starting to see some things lift. Jason, I loved your post over the weekend on social media about let's get back to church. I'm 100% on board with that because, again, the Bible tells us not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together. It's vital that we come together. Chris, I want to start here. As a pastor, what are you starting to see now in 2021? Are you starting to see some hangover effect, if you will, from the pandemic? I want to talk about the importance of faith and keeping that momentum going. I apologize if I'm going in a couple of different directions with the question, but I think you know where I'm going with the question there. Talk about what you've seen so far this year around people and their faith and returning to a church setting.
Yeah. So I've seen two groups of people. I've seen one group that are extremely hungry for what I would describe as the quote unquote more. They want more. And that's more of God, more of his presence, more of his word, more times of prayer, more times of fellowship, more times of getting together, not enough small groups, satisfy, not enough meeting time, satisfy. So there's that group that I think is been motivated by the lack of in 2020. And then there's the other group that I think has grown just extremely comfortable and complacent in some cases as well, but comfortable with what the door opened to in 2020, which was, of course, you can do church now in your living room. You can do church in your pajamas. You can do church with just your family, your cup of coffee, your scrambled eggs and bacon, and and you could accomplish what you want to get accomplished on a Sunday morning without leaving your home and without really, creating a lot of inconveniences in somebody's schedule. So, and I've seen that. We've seen that both in our local church context, but I've also seen it because I'm connected to a lot of other local churches. I've seen it pretty much on a broad spectrum as well. You got those two groups, and they're tough to navigate because as a pastor, my job is to pastor everybody. And at the same time, I believe I'm only called to disciple, a few. And there's a line there, a very thin line there that we probably don't have time to get into at this point. But I think to the point, I think you're seeing these two groups that have emerged in 2021.
Jason, I want to go here what Chris was saying, and your long time work in media. It almost feels like at times, and forgive me for saying this, but Chris, you sparked that inside of me, and I love what you said there about we've almost taken church and made it an on-demand event, almost like a movie, if you will, or a sporting event where we go, okay, great. It's time for church. Let's sit down with some scrambled eggs and coffee. And, it's almost like a television program. Jason, how do we avoid overproducing church services to make it feel like it's just another television program and not an experience? Because I know for myself and my family, when we're in church together and we're with the music's playing, we're in the presence of the Lord, it's a special time. We set aside that time to go to the house of the Lord. I hope I'm asking the question correctly, but I think you're the right person to ask this expertise. How do we keep ourselves from producing out the presence of the Lord in a Zoom? Because a lot of people still don't, forgive me for being long-winded, but a lot of people still don't feel comfortable being in large groups of people and things like that. Yep. How do we keep the authenticity of a church service over an internet platform or things like that?
It's very difficult. Initially you were asking about overproducing, and I think there's a line to that, because you always want to, whatever you do it heartily and do it well. That's Colossians Paul talking in there will tell you, we want to be excellent at what we do. We want to do it all for God, not for man, but we want to be excellent at anything that we put our minds to and work towards, right? To honor him. So you want to put an excellent presentation out if you're going to be online. And there were some that weren't there, some that were there. I remember having conversations with Chris and his church about trying to put an excellent presentation out. What is the way to do that? Because at that point, that's the only way we were able to experience church. And I was talking to a lot of people about imagining if this pandemic hit us in the 90s before the internet happened.
Yeah.
I wonder what it would have been like. Like, would churches have, a lot of churches did die from the pandemic and disintegrate, but would that have been the case? Because or would people have just rebelled and like, we're going to church? Sorry, even though everything was closed. Like, if this had happened at a time when technology wasn't in the forefront like it is now, what would we have done? Would we have just watched Billy Graham on TV and call that our church service in the 90s, right? So I don't know. I will say this, there is nothing that can replicate the experience of encountering Christ in worship and through, preaching and through his word and through fellowship than going to your local church in person and being around other believers. There is nothing that can replicate that. We tried, like Chris said, some people became very comfortable, but I'll speak from my own experience. Sitting there watching church, the message was good. I would always still have my notebook and take notes and try to pay attention to the sermon and learn and but it's just, I could not worship from home. That was just me. I know other people can, but I bet you a majority had the same experience as I did, where you're not around other people and you're not able to enter into the presence of God with worship the same way when you're watching worship on TV.
Can I interject there for a minute?
Please.
I just think that it's so important, because the reason why it's the experience can't be duplicated is because it contradicts the essence of who we are as Christians. When we receive the life of Christ, Christ is 100% relational. And so as part of the Godhead, God is relational. He's Father, Son, Spirit. And so when we receive his life, we receive that reality. We are relational beings made in his image. And so we can't function as the body of Christ without relating to one another, without touching one another, without communicating, without networking, without connecting. It's antithetical to who we are as believers. And so there's a large gap that will exist. There's a barrenness that takes place when we are not in fellowship, just like in, the early church. They made that their priority, not so much because it was a task to complete, but because it was who they were. It was part of their makeup as Christians.
No, Chris, I love what you said there. And there is an energy about being together and worshiping the same God together and being in one mind, as the Bible talked about, being in one mind and one accord. And I'll share this with you. As a keyboard player in my church, I feed off of that energy. Like when I put my hands on the keyboard and we go, I'm all in. My wife will tell you, is like, I don't see him that focused all the time.
Well, Brian, the hidden talent of Mr. Chris Romano, Dr. Chris Romano, is that he plays the drums in his church and his worship band. He's rocking the Ringo Starr like
I love
the drums. So
I love it, man. Well, and again, there is nothing like going into a church service and just being. And I grew up Pentecostal. So that's all I've ever known is high energy and high music and things like that. From the time I was a little kid, that's all I was around. And so it would be very hard for me to step into another setting that wasn't like that, because I'm just, that's the way I'm wired. And so Jason, I love your point about worshiping from home, because I felt the same way at times. It's just kind of like, man, I'm in my jeans and I've got a pullover on or something like that. Man, it's like, I don't like watching church just because I want to be there. I want to be in that moment with my brothers and sisters and things. Chris, I got to ask you this. This made me think about it. How different is it preaching to a camera? I mean, I want to, let's go there for just because Jason and I do podcasts. I mean, you're talking one-on-one to people. You get in that comfort zone. How was it for you transitioning to preaching to a camera and maybe 3 or 4 people there at your church that are there to produce that so you can broadcast online?
It was the most frustrating experience. Now I've been a public speaker my whole adult life. From the time I was 19 years old. So I can wing it. I mean, I'm fairly good at it. But the reality is, again, there's a difference between speaking publicly and preaching the unadulterated word of God, and making a connection with people. There's just such a difference. And, you talked about the energy that's produced in like a worship setting. It's the same way when you're preaching to hundreds of people. And so when those hundreds of people are displaced and you're speaking to a camera, a lot of I took for granted a lot of what was accumulated or what was produced because people were there, even just small connecting points or seeing faces in the crowd that would bring up something, that would remind you of something, that would add to what you were saying, really layer it. And then there's just the reality, and I don't know if everybody in your audience subscribes to this, but I do wholeheartedly. There's a corporate anointing. There's a corporate anointing that takes place when 2 or more are gathered. Christ is there in the midst. And so when it's just you, when it's just a camera, that's lacking. And there's something that is there's just something that is missed in that experience.
Yeah, Jason, you've got something to say there. I know you've got something to add there because your church had a similar situation to Chris's, and what was that experience? And were you a part of the team that was producing those services, or were you and your family just being a part of it like everyone else was at home?
Well, I'm an elder on the board at my church, so I was very involved in the decision-making process of staying open. Should we close? What do we do if we close? All of that. And then what's the presentation look like? I mean, we had a couple of services, I think it was in early May last year, where our online product broke, or the internet went down, or the Wi-Fi broke, and that was the only way to have church. And you're gaining momentum, and initially you saw thousands of people. I think we had like 2,800 views of our Easter service online. That's way, there's a lot of positivity in that. That's a lot of people tuning in to hear about Christ. So there's a lot to be happy for in that, especially when everything was shut down anyway. So you really couldn't have church. Once we were able to get into May and we saw some of our internet issues and things like that, the numbers started dwindling, and you could sense there was online church fatigue. There just was.
Without question.
And people wanted to get back. And by June, I know Chris's church did, we were able to get back in person. It was different. We were social distance. People had to sign up. There was masks. There was all of these sort of regulations that we were trying to follow and protocols that we were trying to follow. And we didn't know as much then as we do now. We were using hand sanitizer like it was going out of style. Now we're hearing that, it's pretty hard to catch coronavirus through, your hands, transmitted through handshaking and things like that. But we were taking all the precautions we could. It's still, even to this day, as we record this in the, early spring, we still are not back to where we were pre-COVID. And it's going to take a while for a couple of reasons. One, we're still following protocols. Hopefully we get into May and June, I think things are really going to start to go back to, hopefully somewhat pre-COVID measures as far as being able to just gather together. But although this is my biggest concern, Brian, is the drift. And I preached on this in 2019, ironically, the slow drift, or the slow fade, as the song by Casting Crowns goes, that so many of us can fall a prey to. And I think I've seen this more in 2020 and into 2021 than I've ever seen. And that's my biggest concern, because you want to stay connected with people. You want to kind of encourage them. Hey, we haven't seen you in a while. Are you doing okay? Can we hang out? Do you want to come back to church? And some people just are drifted far enough to where they don't even have an issue with missing church or not coming back, but they are fine going everywhere else. And that to me is a huge, huge concern.
Well, and we had our church, I'll say this real quick and we'll pivot to our last point, but our church, we had 32 members of our church that had COVID. We had several hospitalized. Yep. And so, and I don't mind saying it now because we're far enough removed from it, but our church made national news. Yeah. We were on that. And Jay, I texted with you and said, hey, pray for our church. And I texted with several people, friends of mine across the country that I knew that were in leadership positions. I texted my buddy Al Robertson down in Louisiana and said, hey, pray for our church, because we were fighting a good number, probably 10% of our church that had tested positive for COVID. We had to totally shut down for almost a month with no services at all.
A buddy of mine's church up here, Brian, half their church, and I'm not kidding, it's over 100 people, half their church got COVID. Yeah. And it's different today, I think, than it was in 2020 when that happens. You know, the protocols and the procedures, and you follow through, but it's still, it's a real thing. Hopefully with the vaccinations, or just with, herd immunity and things like that, we're going to be in a better spot, and get back to where we were.
Let's wrap up this conversation here. I've got one more question. Man, this has been so good. So good. Chris, what's the one thing that you will take? What lesson will you take from your experience around pastoring through a pandemic? And Jason, I ask you the same question, but Chris, I want to start with you. What's the one thing that you will take a lesson you've learned from the pandemic?
I think adaptability, recognizing that things are going to change, and we all sort of resist change. As people, we like the norms of our lives. We like to kind of keep to the script, so to speak. And so when we have these interruptions, whether they're from the outside or from the inside, I think it requires us as people to recognize that if we don't become, or at least we don't continue to work on becoming adaptable, then you're really going to create more problems, and you're not going to be as effective as you could be. And so, I mean, that was the major takeaway for me walking through 2020 and walking through all the different changes that took place. Was I had to be, as a leader, I had to become adaptable so that I could be positioned in a way that could help other people who maybe weren't as willing to become adaptable. Because that's what leaders do. We have to make those sacrifices, even if we don't like, what that's going to end up looking like. We have to make those sacrifices for the sake of serving other people. And so that's been a continual theme, as both of you know, as I've moved into 2021, and a lot of changes are on the horizon for me and for my family, and now for our church as a result of it. It's still maintaining that flexibility, that childlikeness, so that I, abide in him and listen to his voice and ultimately follow his lead in his direction where he's taking us and taking me. So, yeah, I think that would be the answer to your question.
Yeah, go ahead, Jason. Yeah,
Brian, the word that was coming to my mind was opportunity. And that's piggybacks off of what Chris just said, which I think is adaptability is a big one. I mean, it shows how out of, and in a, a snap of the finger is just like, Thanos in Endgame, everything can change. Right. And when you think about 2020, I remember praying through and thinking through, especially talking to Chris and others, like what an opportunity for the church, what an opportunity to stand for Christ in the midst of what I feel was like a giant, I don't know what the right word is, but there was a large amount of fear that was being sold and that people were buying, unfortunately. And listen, I got caught up in some of that too. And I just thought, what a great opportunity for the church to stand up and to show in a positive way how God can really be glorified in the midst of a storm, everybody that I've talked to, a lot of the athletes that I've talked to have referred to James 1, consider it joy when you face trials of many kind. And it's becoming a little bit cliche, unfortunately. And I have to read through that whole scripture again because too many people are using it just for that. But I think there's some truth to that in the sense that, and that's where Dr. Romano comes in with the PhD to help me on my scripture reading. But I will say the opportunity to glorify God in whatever it is. So for us, like in the work I do with Sports Spectrum, there was opportunity to bring more people on and talk about Jesus. There was opportunity to have more conversations outside of just the normal conversations with regards to race and culture and faith, and kind of looking through all that was taking place in the summer last year with regards to the racial divide, but through the lens of the gospel, right? So there was opportunity to see what justice was like through what the scriptures had to say and through the life that Jesus lived. And so there was a lot of opportunity here. And there was an opportunity to educate ourselves, and there was an opportunity to really jump towards unity. Unfortunately, a lot of people failed in that regard too. And we ended up in many cases being more divisive than ever. But I think the church had an opportunity. I think we can look back and say, did we do it perfectly? No way. We messed up a lot, especially those who proclaim to be people of faith, weren't living very Christ-like lives in a lot of cases, or demonstrating Christ-like attitudes, or in the way that they were posting on social media or whatever. We all screwed up in that regards on some level. But I think when I look back and I say, okay, whatever the next this is pandemic, because that was a pandemic that affected everybody's world, and Chris and I will tell you, we've had very little, and we know it's coming, but very little pandemic-like storms that have come into our lives as our family. Yeah. Go back to my grandfather in 2007. That's the last time we've really had to do. I mean, we've had our stuff. Like Chris has had his stuff last year that he's had to go through in his family. We've had our things that we've had to walk through in our family, in our little family, but nothing really tragic pandemic like. But it's going to come, because we're just humans and we're going to die, and we're alive right now, but something's going to come. And if you're not in it, you're going to go through it. I think what I've learned, though, is that I hope when the next pandemic-like thing happens, that I look at it as an opportunity to praise God. Yeah. And not just complain or whine or even be fearful, and truly live that faith out. A lot of people this year have had to put their, faith has been tested. Let's put it that way. Yeah. And I've talked to many of those people. And so I look at it as opportunity. I really do.
Well, I think the next book you should do, Jason, is how to lead your disagreeable brothers when you have conflict in sporting events. Yeah, I mean, maybe Dr. Chris Romano could write the foreword to that.
No, let him write the book. I don't want to write any more books. I'll put my name on it with him, but he's writing the book, not me.
Yeah. Well, you've done the heavy lifting. Tell people how they can get connected with you guys, because I know people want to connect with you. Chris, tell folks how they can connect with you, and Jay, do the same thing.
Well, I'll start because Chris looks like he might have been a little froze up there for a second.
You can
go ahead, Chris.
You can find me on Facebook, Christopher Romano, Twitter, CJ Romano 21. I'm also on Instagram as well. And you can also visit our website, our college website at www.vcbcs.org.
Nice. I love that. And for me, guys, you can just hit me up on my socials as well. I'm on Twitter and Instagram pretty frequently. And then 2 plugs. I'll plug, first of all, my books, which you mentioned, Brian. And those are available on Amazon and everywhere. But really, I want to direct people to sportspectrum.com, which is the work I get to do every day. Telling people about Jesus through sports. I get the magazine over my shoulder here. And it's just, we're really proud of our ministry and continuing to work in the media space, but in a unique way that nobody else is really doing to glorify God. So yeah, sportspectrum.com is the best place for that.
Yeah, man, what a great conversation. And guys, this has been I knew it was going to be great. You guys were both even better than I thought you would be. And grateful to know you both and call you friends. Thank you for joining me today on the Intentional Encourager podcast.
Thanks, Brian.
Brian, thank you, buddy.
My thanks as always to producer Bryce Sexton and technical advisor Matt Means. And of course, the ultimate thanks goes to the Lord Jesus Christ, who provides intentional encouragement every day through his word. If you're not subscribed to the Intentional Encourager podcast, hit the subscribe button wherever you get podcasts so you don't miss an exciting episode where you can get encouraged and stay encouraged. And remember, anyone, anywhere, and anytime, any place can be an intentional encourager.